Good morning. Good morning. I'm Pete Daly, CEO of the U.S. Naval Institute, and we welcome you. And I'd just like to ask Bob Harward started that. I'd like to ask our audience to stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. And welcome to our conference on military and politics, proper participation, or perilous partisanship. We're deeply grateful to the William M. Wood Foundation in Boston for sponsoring this conference, and representing them here today are Mr. Ed Condit and Ms. Emma Green, and we thank them. Each year, the Naval Institute partners with the Naval Academy to host this history conference on applied history to explore important issues and their place. Throughout the nation's history, starting with George Washington, there's been crossover from service in the military to political office. Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, Ike Eisenhower, Jimmy Carter, and many others followed in this path. And of course, there's many scores more that served in influential positions in presidential administrations, in government, and in Congress. Those of us who served remember how strongly the Department of Defense and the military services encouraged us to vote. They really made a big effort to turn out the vote because it was our right as citizens. We always have to ask the question, how can military members cast a vote without tracking politics? The lines get more complicated once military members leave active service. Is it okay to use your military title to land a job, to sell a product, or advocate for a political candidate? Many maintain that that inevitably leads to partisanship that hurts the military. Others would argue, indeed, they would say it's an obligation for every citizen, including military members, to participate. So we're privileged to have with us today a distinguished group of speakers, panelists, and moderators to explore and discuss this very topic of military participation. And we've had the pleasure of working with Brendan Doherty of the Political Science Department to build the conference, and also with additional midshipman groups on campus, including especially the Allies Civil Military Relations Club and Midshipman Artem Sherbanin and Midshipman Michael McKinney. We welcome all the Naval Academy midshipmen with us here today, all our guests, all the cadets who have traveled from West Point to be here today, as well as a number of midshipmen from George Washington University and students from the Severn School. It's now my pleasure to introduce the 62nd Superintendent of the Naval Academy. Vice Admiral Ted Carter graduated from the Academy in 1981. In 1982, he earned his designation as a naval aviator. In 1985, graduated Top Gun. He spent extensive time around the world in deployments. He flew combat missions in support of joint operations in Bosnia, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kosovo. He accumulated more than 6,000 flight hours in fighter aircraft, holds the record for carrier landings among all aviators, active and retired. He's commanding officer of the USS Camden, AOE-2, USS Carl Vinson, CVN-70. He was the strike group commander for the Enterprise Strike Group on her last combat deployment in 2012. Admiral Carter also served as the 54th president of the Naval War College. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the Soup.
Good morning, everyone. What a great crowd to have here. I am so impressed you're here on this beautiful 5 October 2017 day in what I believe, and this is my 4th year as superintendent, the best lineup of speakers I've seen show up for this conference. So congratulations to Admiral Pete Daly, the U.S. Naval Institute, the Wood Foundation. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. Now, I am just basically serving as your backdrop today. I mean, we get to host you here at the U.S. Naval Academy. As you may or may not know, in just 5 short days, we will be celebrating our Founders Day, 172 years young. So as you walk around the campus, for those who are not familiar, we call it the Yard here. Please note that we're only 338 acres, and we, just like most things, we stole it from the U.S. Army 172 years ago when this was Old Fort Severn. And I'm encouraged to see not only so many midshipmen here today, but our cadets from West Point and other midshipmen. This is the one time a year where both Naval Academy midshipmen and cadets from West Point will agree on one thing: beat Air Force. So yeah, that's coming up this Saturday. The topic that you will hear discussed today could not be more relevant, not only for those of us that have been around defense, those of us that actively serve, or those that are aspiring to be commissioned officers. Just this morning, there was an article in the Daily Signal about the strength of our military and where it resides. Now, that's a backdrop to what is happening today. The active duty force of our U.S. military is less than 1.5 million officer and enlisted, arguably the smallest in terms of not just people, but even in aging hardware dating back to World War I. So that also serves as the backdrop. And if you were to take a look at American opinion polls about where the U.S. military fits, going back to the Pew research that was recently done in the fall of 2016, and a Gallup poll that just listed American opinion about different organizations and groups of people that was just done this past summer, the U.S. military still ranks at its very highest. Between 72 and 79% of all Americans still believe that the U.S. military is the most trusted organization and believe that they are the biggest contributors to our national security. All of this serves as a backdrop to how the U.S. military fits within its servant role and our civilian leadership. And I think the speakers that you will see lined up here, including our principal keynote speaker here this morning, who has spoken extensively on this topic, will serve to make us think deeply about the role of our military and how it fits in today's political environment. So my real job here this morning is to introduce our first guest speaker. Admiral Mike Mullen grew up in Los Angeles, California. He's a 1968 graduate here of the United States Naval Academy. Everybody probably knows him. He's a household name. He has served at every level of command on ships, from destroyers to cruisers to strike groups, Commander 2nd Fleet. For me personally, and anybody that was in the great class of 1981, we remember him as the first company officer here at the Naval Academy in 1977 and 78. I was in first company, so you can't make this stuff up. But he has served, maybe most famously, as one of only 3 officers to have served 4 times in 4 different billets as a 4-star admiral. Commander Naval Forces Europe, Vice Chief of Naval Operations, our Chief of Naval Operations, and then eventually the role that many of you remember, the 17th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So please give a warm Annapolis welcome to Admiral Mike Mullen.
Thanks, Coach. Well, good morning. It's great to be with you. I want to thank, first of all, the SOUP for providing the venue and also just your stewardship over the last 4 years. It's been terrific. This is a special place. Also, Pete Daly and the Institute, Ed Condit, and the Wood Foundation for sponsoring this. In my view, this is long overdue. I'm particularly delighted that there's so many mids here and that there are cadets from West Point and mids from GW and young people, and I'll explain why in just a second. My background on this, you would think, would go back 5 decades. It is something when I was a midshipman that I don't think we studied, and we didn't spend much time on, as I recall. Even as I grew up in the Navy, didn't spend a lot of time on it, and part of that reason is I was a Washington outsider. I didn't really show up in Washington until I was a flag officer, and then seemingly from that point on, I never left. So my learning on this, really practical learning, began in great part in the mid to late 90s. And then as I moved up the ranks and became the head of the Navy, this is 2005, 2007. And these are watershed years for me in the whole issue of civilian-military relations or the military and politics. You would remember in that time frame it was the Iraq War. It wasn't going well. I'm a member of the Joint Chiefs. As the CNO, Pete Pace is the chairman, Ed Giambastiani is the vice chairman, and the Bush administration is in trouble in the Iraq War. And about a year into the job, I started to invest myself pretty heavily into, from a Joint Chiefs perspective, into what are we doing, why are we doing it, how is this going to turn out? And we knew it wasn't going well, and we had vigorous debates in the tank over the course of 5 or 6 months to get to a position which I'll talk about in a second. That's to say, the Joint Chiefs are not exposed to the politics in this country at a level that the chairman and the vice chairman are. It's just, it isn't even close, and I couldn't have told you that if I hadn't moved into the chairman's job, much to my surprise. I had been in DC almost 10 years at that point. You think you have your antenna up, you know what's going on, and one day Bob Gates calls me into his office, and the first thing I notice, and this was May of 2007, first thing I notice is the horse holders aren't there. So right away I know something's up, even though I didn't understand exactly. Gates asked me to sit down at his small table next to his desk, and he starts to have a conversation with me. And about 20 seconds in, I figured out that he was going to ask me to relieve Pete Pace as chairman. And I went into one of those slow motion movies in your head. I could hear him talking in the background, not really focusing on what he was saying. And I'm going, holy cow, are you kidding me? Because I had no idea that this was going to happen. About a minute later, Bob stopped talking, said the president wanted me to take the job. I said, I've been living with a woman for almost 40 years. I need to go have a discussion with her about this. We did that, and I took the job. The lesson on Pete Pace, though, is an important one, because none of us, including myself, really understood it until it happened. And the reason Pete Pace didn't get nominated for a second tour is he was caught in the middle of the electricity on the Iraq War. And Bob Gates had gone to the Hill, seen Carl Levin and John McCain, found out that there was no support for the president to renominate Pete Pace. Now, I'd known Pete my last year here, my second class year at the Naval Academy. Pete lived across the hall from me. So I've known Pete since I was a second-class midshipman. And he got caught, and at that point in time, the president didn't have enough horsepower to overcome the resistance, thus the move to me. So people say, well, what was it like to be chairman? Great privilege, great country, middle-class kid from Southern California can grow up and be chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That's one. Second, you walk into the White House and the hair goes up on the back of your neck, and as Bob Gates and I oftentimes discussed, when that stopped, you needed to leave the job because it's an incredibly special place. And thirdly, it was completely foreign to me. There is no training to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and it was completely foreign because of the politics. People in the White House have been living politics, breathing politics, 24/7, 365 for since our country was founded. And in that's what they do. And the chairman is the single military voice, independent, apolitical, as an advisor to the president and to the Secretary of Defense, as well as the National Security Council. So you are basically alone. And you don't have the knowledge. I mean, if you just flip this over, take a politician, bring him into our life after 40 years, and within 1 year, try to have that individual figure it out. It's a real challenge because it's a different life and a different culture. We're also in the middle of the Iraq War. This is an execution. I'm a sailor. At this point in time, I got 2 ground wars, and so I head off to find out what's going on the ground. What I learned at that time was was how challenging the political environment was. And I was learning as I went. And for me, the Iraq War timeframe really broke open this whole issue of civ mil, et cetera. And so what you also then started to see were retired generals and admirals. Oftentimes it's just the generals that are referred to. Believe me, there have been plenty of admirals that are out there as well. Many of them paid consultants to give their views on what was going on in the Iraq War. And they had views that were oftentimes not very well informed, even though they thought they were, and they certainly made themselves sound like they were. And oftentimes it was against the policy of the President of the United States. And that really got my attention. And I was pretty well known at that point in time to strongly object to that and to them. And the main message was they are actually damaging the profession that they grew up in to their own benefit in terms of their careers, and that they would profess to really care about. And that's the underpinning principle here. So since that time, obviously that was 2007, 2011, and then I watched this progress over time. And what did I see, how did I see this manifested? I see politicians who have worked hard to get national security professionals, particularly retired generals and admirals, on their team to improve or to burnish their credibility, if you will. I see policymakers who bring them on their team to basically reinforce their national security views, help shape, but also and when I say bring them on the team, I mean very visibly. I don't mean just behind the scenes, because I think there is a place behind the scenes to do all this. And you see, and I'll give you, three quick examples. Richard Danzig, who's a dear friend of mine, was Secretary of the Navy in the late 90s. When I was chairman, we would have a Christmas party, and a lot of people came over, and this was 2008. And the party was basically focused on wounded and families, but we had a lot of friends, and Richard was one. And I knew Richard was then recruiting hard to get generals and admirals to come out visibly for Obama, who was running at the time. I didn't have a lot of time to talk to Richard, but as he was walking out the door, I grabbed him. I said, "Richard, you got to stop doing this." And he goes, and if you know Richard at all and you catch him, he'll tilt his head. And he's a terribly bright guy, and I knew I'd caught him off guard because everything he thought he was doing was okay. And I walked through the damage to the institution that it was doing to have nothing but generals and admirals show up in support of our presidential candidates, visibly show up in support. And Danzig looked at me and he said, I can't do that. I said, why is that? Because it would be unilateral withdrawal. And the next day, he sends me an article from the Arlington Times to show me the 150 general officers and admirals who'd signed up for McCain. And if I back up to 2004, I can remember Kerry's convention with a multitude of flag officers on the podium on the dais during that convention as well. In my time, I'm sure it had happened before that, but those were very visible moments for me. Secondly, when Obama comes in, one of the first photos, Gitmo was a big deal, and one of the first photos that I saw, and I think it was within the first few days, there were a dozen or so flag officers, generals and admirals who were posing with President Obama in the Oval at his desk as Obama had signed the closed Gitmo order. And they all felt very strongly about that. And this isn't about whether they feel strongly or not. My own view is the President of the United States doesn't need that photo op. And secondly, and I knew a bunch of these individuals, had worked with them, they also didn't understand the damage they were doing to the institution at that time. Those were two very specific examples about how far this had gone. And at that point in time, I said, this cat's long gone out of the bag. I mean, what are we going to do about it? I turned to Anne Rondeau, who was running National Defense University at the time, and said, we need to start to go to the 04s and teach them. What I wish I had done in retrospect is gone to the SUPs at the service academies and start here, because one of the really deleterious impacts of this is we are training our young that this is okay. And you see it time and time and time again. The other impact, or another aspect of this, how this manifests itself, or I worry about this, at a time where the American public knows less and less about us as a military. We're less than 1%. We come from fewer places. We've bracked our way out of areas in the country that we will never go back to. We're not present in the Northeast anymore. So we're not teaching in the schools. We're not sending our kids there. We're not coaching in Little League. We're not seeing them in the churches, et cetera. They don't know us. And that has been a worry for some time. And to Pete's point about, or I think the SUP's point about how the American military is seen, and I'm sensitive to that. I'm a Vietnam guy, and for those of you who haven't had a chance to watch that 10-part series, it's a pretty jarring series about that time. But those you know, in that from that perspective, we are in a place where the American people, not knowing what they used to know about us, they have this great regard, which I'm delighted for. But the other message is, and those of us that have been around a while know this, yes, we're good. Yes, we're better. We're infinitely better than we were in the 60s and the 70s in that time frame. But we're not that good. We're not as good as everybody says we are, and nor should we drink that Kool-Aid all the time. And that's part of the message that needs to get fed back to individuals who want to pat us on the back. And I think it's extremely dangerous in that regard in terms of what's going on and how we're seen in this whole Civ Mill piece. How does it manifest itself? It manifests itself in a couple ways. Over time, do we just become another constituent group? And if we do, we're in trouble. We're in trouble as an institution, and we're in trouble as a country. Secondly, and there are very few officers, and Colin Powell's going to be here in a little while, and you can ask him about this, there are very few individuals that get to sit in the Oval Office and have a discussion with the President of the United States about who the next 3- or 4-star officer is going to be in these major positions in the military. And shame on us if we get to a point where part of that discussion, implied if not stated, is to have the president and his or her staff scratch their head wondering about the politics of Mike Mullen when Bob Gates takes my name over to see President Bush and said he's the right guy to take over from Pete Pace. If we get to that point, we are politicized far beyond anything that we can understand. I think it's really important, and again, I go back to training our youth. I think it's really important to draw a bright line here when there are no more bright lines. Everything is gray. We seem to like it gray. Gray gives permission to do things that we hadn't thought about before. And as you can imagine, I was not a happy guy at the political conventions in the most recent election. Mike Flynn was my J2. I knew him really well. He worked for me for well over a year in that regard, and then he obviously went to Afghanistan with Stan McChrystal. And I knew him well there as well. John Allen I knew when he was a 5-striper here as a mid. I've known John my whole life. He was the commandant here, the first Marine to do that. I couldn't have been more delighted. But to have those two individuals become principal speakers at a political convention in support of candidates publicly, and they can defend themselves, and I know they're happy to do that, is another big log on this fire, from my perspective, which has been burning now for some time and been reinforced time and time again by one political move after another. And I should do this, I'm embarrassed to say I haven't. What is also a head scratcher for me is I'm not sure that our participation with any of these politicians has made any difference, in the outcome of their election. And when we get into a situation like this, I'm always curious about, where patient zero is. There is a view that patient zero on this issue was P.X. Kelly in 1992 and Bill Crow, and I adore them both, but they both very publicly endorsed Clinton in 1992, which for those of us that have been around a while was a very difficult endorsement because of Clinton's background, because of the Vietnam War, lots of things that got rolled into that. And then since that time, certainly others have done the same thing. Now, I do draw a bright line with someone like Wes Clark. Wes Clark made a conscious decision to become a politician and run for president. And when you kick to that level, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. Lord knows we need talent, in that group. But that's a very rare occurrence, from my perspective. I also think these are serious issues that they want to know a lot about. I think advising quietly behind the scenes is something else, that's really important, because we do have an expertise and we can help individuals that we care about understand it. I am associated with a 501c3 that is run by a couple of Iraq-Afghanistan vets, one of whom got out of the Marine Corps, made a lot of money, and is now putting that money to work to recruit young veterans to run for Congress next year. And they have targeted about 100 veterans who are interested in doing that, and they're not going to support that many. And they are doing this in principle because the literature shows that someone who has been in the military, seen the world, gone through what many of us have gone through, much more likely they will have a bipartisan view. And I know you've noticed is that, the moderates have left the building. They're not here. All of this is also going on at a time where, from my perspective, that I wasn't paying enough attention. I said that earlier, but from my perspective, the political partisanship is at an all-time high. And it's almost like that partisanship, there's a direct correlation between that partisanship and the ability or the inability to get anything done. And somehow, this bubble, which is not very far from us in Washington, D.C., is able to say time and time and time again, that must be okay. That's not what the American people are saying, by the way, and I think that's part of what happened in this election last year. The American people are fed up with Washington, D.C., and they're looking for any possible way to send that message. What you don't see is you don't see very many people leaving Washington, D.C. once elected. Lastly, and then I'll open it up for questions, I am increasingly, I'm not surprised, but I'm increasingly concerned about the dependence of the American people on Jim Mattis, H.R. McMaster, John Kelly, and Rex Tillerson. In fact, I heard again this morning, just listening to the news of, quote unquote, they are the bulwark. I think one of the questions is, will that bulwark last? And what happens if and when it doesn't? My own belief is it won't. I know that certainly I know all the generals well. They're extraordinary individuals in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. But the question that I ask is, how did we get here to a point where we are depending on retired generals for the stability of our system? And what happens if that bulwark breaks, first of all? And then many of us have been in lots of countries in the world. I have been in too many countries globally where the generals, if you will, gave great comfort to their citizens. That is not the United States of America. It may be temporarily now. I can only hope that it won't be in the future. And despite each one of these individuals' greatness, there are limits. And then I guess I'd wrap up, or I'd end where I started. When I walked into the Oval Office for the first time, that is an environment I had never been in before, ever. That's the environment H.R. McMaster, Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, and John Kelly are into as we speak. They, like me and every other chairman, save the one that you'll see after this, in terms of background, because Colin Powell had been the National Security Advisor on active duty before, but save him, none of us had that preparation. There is no reason to think that these three individuals who are exceptionally good have any better preparation in that regard, so they are trying to figure it out as we go. This is an area I teach at Princeton. I have for the last 4 or 5 years, and I teach a course on that Princeton the Wilson School let me put together called U.S. Military Power, U.S. Diplomatic Power, Achieving the Right Balance. And the thesis is really, the underpinning thesis is, it's way too easy to go to war. And the weapons are much more lethal and that much more remote. And the power of the presidency has increased dramatically in terms of this, particularly when you have a Congress that will stand up to practically nothing. And that's the world that we're living in right now. They will stand up to nothing. And they are the representatives of the American people, and they will continue to stand up to nothing until the American people say, enough, this has got to change. And in that regard, it's very, very dangerous. Part of that course is I talk about civ-mil relations, and by extension, obviously, you know, the military and politics, or military and politicians. We spend a fair amount of time on that. What I've found is there are things I wished I'd known before I took the job as chairman, not that I wouldn't have taken it, but this is an extraordinarily complex issue that goes back literally to our founding. One of the individuals we look at in time is Lincoln. I would commend to you Elliot Cohen's view of this. He teaches at SAIS in Washington and is a pretty good friend. He's given this a lot of thought. There are others who have done so as well, but they're not legion and they're not bestsellers. But for us, in our world, and I don't even know, I should know, I don't even know that we teach it here in a world where it is so dramatically more intense than what it used to be. So I would encourage my former plebe as a company officer to continue to take some direction. I mean, it's a really, really critical topic, and it's going to be out there. It's not going to go away. There's plenty of grist for the mill, certainly with what's going on now and with where this movie goes down the road. Lastly, I may have said that a couple times. We just went through a couple thoughts. One is a lot of comments about CNO and the other chiefs talking about Charlottesville. What gets lost in that commentary is that leaders of organizations, ours in particular, have an obligation to talk to their people about these kinds of issues. This wasn't about John Richardson or Bob Neller or Mark Milley or Fingers Goldfein pushing back on the president. This was about responsibility to lead and be very clear what is okay and what isn't okay. And I really commend what they did, because it is not easy to speak in this environment right now. But that is a tremendous responsibility, and I commend them for that. This 10-part series in Vietnam is surprising to all of us, those of us that, frankly, lived in that time frame, and yet, because it brings back a lot of bad memories for any of us that were here. I was here as a mid in '68, graduating, you know, and I was then wooing this young lady that was to eventually become my wife, and I wanted to go to DC and take her out, and I couldn't get in there because it was burning and it was barricaded, and it was incredibly intense at that time. We got through that. We got through it, and we became a better country because of it. We are going through a very difficult time right now. We need leaders to unify this country, not divide this country. We need them to step up. We need those that would sit on the sidelines and continue to criticize and have capability to step in. And that will start to happen. I actually believe that. That said, we're going to get through this. We're going to be better for it, but it is not going to be a fun ride. It hasn't been, and it won't be. In particular, those who are here in uniform, and who wore the uniform in their career, I just want to say thanks for all you've done for our country in so many ways that it's very hard to talk about. But you've made a huge difference at a critical time, and we need your continued service. This is a noble calling. Noble calling. That's why that line has to be, so bright. Thanks, and I'm open to questions. If I understand the logistics, I think there are a couple mics back here somewhere. Go ahead.
Sir, Midshipman First Class Kraz Nation, 3rd Company. I had a question about your last comment. In your view, to what extent is it appropriate for active duty officers, flag or otherwise, to come out against, in opposition, I guess, to the administration in defense of the apolitical military as an institution, and when such an argument just could be inherently politicized by the media public?
The way this works is we serve at the pleasure. The President of the United States is elected, duly elected in the democracy we support. We have vigorous debates internally. And when the President makes a decision, we march off and we carry it out. And we don't complain about it. The complaint is manifested, in my view, only in one way. And that is, you have your resignation letter, you cannot support this, and you walk. And you walk quietly. You don't make a big scene about it. That's the message. And believe me, that's a very powerful message. Sometimes we underestimate the power of that it needs to be somehow characterized, put in context. It doesn't. That's what you do, and that message gets heard loud and clear. If I were going to pick 2 individuals that I care deeply about on this issue, one is George Marshall, who's a hero of mine. Read about his background, understand how he approached it. He was an incredibly humble guy who basically walked the walk of never taking off his uniform even after he retired. And the other is Chuck Boyd. Chuck Boyd was a U.S. Air Force 4-star, great friend, mentor of mine, POW for 7+ years in Vietnam. And Chuck gave an eloquent speech on this topic in May of 2006 at the Air War College, at their graduation. And in that is included a lot of what I talked about today. We actually, and Pete said this, I think, in the introduction, yes, we have the right. This isn't about whether you, as a retired naval officer or soldier, have the right. You have the right. That's not in question. The question is, how much damage are you doing to the institution you cared about? And I think there's a debate about how much damage to the institution and how much damage to the country. But to think that it's not being done, I think is, you're just being blind, or we are being blind. Go ahead.
Sir, Midshipman Second Class Casey Baker. Military members, officers enlisted alike, possess a certain method of thinking. Although we have exposure to different countries, their government, and their citizenry, we view the world through a certain lens. Do you feel that, if successful, your 501c3 organization will lead to a militarization of Congress?
No. After World War II, from 1945 until about 1945 to now, we've gone from about 70% of the congressional members were veterans to now down to 20. And I think that's, I mean, when you jump, you don't know, it depends on how good you are, but when you jump into politics, you figure out politics. And what you have is that background. And obviously we're a long way away from anything like that right now. I think their experience, and actually what I said is most key, which is a group that is, at least from the literature, has typically much more likely to be bipartisan, which is what I would argue we need. That doesn't mean they give up their views, but they would be willing to work across the aisle, and I think that's what American people are screaming for right now.
Thank you, sir.
Go ahead.
Sir Ensign Lowry, how do the families of military members play into this bright line? I ask because recently the wife of American sniper Chris Kyle wrote an open letter to the NFL, a highly politicized one, and the media has taken it in the light of her late husband, Chris Kyle, rather than as her as a private citizen.
Great question. I think, and I appreciate that. I am, not happy with the way the NFL players are protesting. That actually really, really appalls me. That said, I wore the uniform so they could do that and believe that firmly. But an example in this particular case of what's happened to the military is somehow the parties involved have conflated this to be in support or not in support of the United States military. And that is dead wrong. It has nothing to do with your support of the United States military or not. I actually know her, I haven't seen the letter, but it does speak to the environment and to, quite frankly, the ability to, I guess I'd say, react strongly along, your own views with what's going on. I've been around long enough now. Any of us, from my perspective, any of us that don't think we don't have issues with race in this country, I just don't think you're looking at what's going on. And we need to continue to address those. It's been a long time since the Civil War. It's going to be a long time until we get this right. But we have got to continue to address it. Otherwise, it will further divide us. Back to what I said earlier, we need unifiers, not dividers right now. And we don't have many unifiers around. So, that's how I would respond to that particular issue.
Thank you, sir.
Go ahead.
Sir, Cadet Wilson, United States Military Academy, Company D2. Earlier you mentioned a distinction between retired senior service members that publicly support campaigns and those that actually run for public office. Would you mind expounding on that distinction?
So if I feel strongly and I want to support candidate Obama, and I'm a retired admiral or general, there are lots of ways to do that privately. There are lots of ways to do that, and they're really critical ways. But what I also view this as, I'd have the same discussion with, not that you would need to in that case, with John McCain, and his people, so that both sides have the opportunity to listen to what I've got to say about a particular issue. There are very few presidential candidates in my lifetime who have a significant amount of experience on national security issues. Certainly President Obama didn't. President Bush was limited. President Clinton was limited. So there are some, but fewer and fewer, it seems, over time. So that advice, I think, is really important advice. Where I draw the line is, which is what the campaign would want you to do. is come out publicly and endorse. That goes back to the Richard Danzig, story from my perspective. And the lack of analysis that I've seen, does that really make a difference in an election in the long run? Retired, generals and admirals, extraordinarily capable people with well thought through views and expertise. And it also goes back to what I said about appearing on television for, you pick the channel, espousing your views, also being paid to do it. And most of the people in America, whether you're a lieutenant colonel or a 4-star, they think you're an expert. And I've seen individuals that I know that aren't experts, but I know that. Most of the American people do not know that. And that's another, mixed message from the standpoint of what's okay and what isn't okay. Because Lieutenant Colonel Mullen is and it is sometimes very difficult, despite the fact that it says Lieutenant Colonel Mullen, U.S. Army retired, in the banner on the bottom of the story, most Americans don't distinguish. They don't distinguish. And in fact, because so few active duty military officers actually appear on television, those individuals who do, retired, they become the experts. Just de facto, they're the experts. They must know what they're doing.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. How can we best protect ourselves from North Korea? It's a very, very dangerous situation. I've been around a long time, worked it hard. There are two indicators that I would look to in terms of whether we're making progress or not. Watch what Jim Mattis says, Secretary of Defense Mattis, watch his words. He's been very clear that it's through diplomacy. And the other is watch for any movement out of Beijing. Is China interested? In terms of actually making something happen. China is interested, there's no question about that. But will they make something happen about where this goes? But it's more dangerous than I've ever seen. He's 33 years old. He's unethical. He's evil. And of world leaders that I know, and there are those that say there's no way he'd pull that trigger, I'm not so sure. I'm not willing to take that chance. I'm also not willing to take the chance, well, let's just give it to him and contain him, because that then ups the odds, from my perspective, that we will proliferate nuclear weapons in the region. Possibly South Korea, Japan, et cetera. It's just like Iran. If they get them, will Saudi get them? Will Egypt get them? Will Turkey get them? And I think that endangers everybody, actually. So I hope, and I don't know, I hope there are lots of behind-the-scenes things going on that will allow us to climb down, if you will, from where we are on that issue. Go ahead.
Dr. Robert Kurtz, this is building on your last question, and it's probably more tactless than it should be. You can chalk that up to my being former Army, not Navy. My question
That's okay. Actually, I'm a joint guy. I grew to love the Army, except on one day each year.
Thank you. In the here and now, with this president, what do you think senior officers at the service chief and chairman level should do if ordered by this president to strike the first blow in a nuclear war?
They are obviously much more aware of the circumstances in which they sit than I am. I've certainly been there, but I think it's more likely now. The question is, would they intercept it? And would they intercept the order? Would they intervene? And I just don't know the answer to that. I've been asked since President Trump was elected about the football and what's the timing on this, et cetera. And in a response, if you will, in other words, if nuclear weapons have been fired at us from Russia, the response time is pretty small. It's not like you can get a committee together and say, what do you think about this? The president's got to make a decision. That is obviously not the case for what I would call first strike if the president decided to do it himself. certainly, theoretically, there's a way to intervene and have the discussion. In the end, it's going to be up to them. It's going to be up to them. And then I think the question, it goes back, to some degree, it goes back to the bulwark statement that I made, is what happens next? Where do we go? And I mean, back to the 70s, it's my view that the checks and balances are kicking in the courts. They're kicking in Congress painfully slowly. They always are slow in Congress. But, if I were going to say what happens next, Congress better stand up pretty quickly to make sure that whatever happens, that we are stable as we move forward.
I'd say that because we know that Secretary Schlesinger intercepted in President Nixon's declining days.
As I understand it, and you can ask Bob Woodward, he's here. As I understand it, Schlesinger gave an order, or gave guidance, which is an order, by the way, from my perspective, when the SecDef says to some military guy, if he gets itchy on this, call me, or something like that. And I think that's pretty well documented. That is one example. But I honestly have no idea where Secretary of Defense Mattis is on anything like this right now.
Thank you.
I have a question on your bright line. How do you look at the reserve part of the force? You depended on, in the war, 51% were there supporting.
Yeah.
If one day are civilians, the next day find themselves in the military. How does that bright line fit to that?
So how do they see it? I want that to be a real hard problem for them. The question is, how do we look at reserves? Actually, a follow-on from me on that I'll answer is, what about the Guard? I didn't know anything about the Army Guard or the Air Guard until I became chairman, and then I learned a lot. And when you are, and certainly it comes in play right now just with these incredible tragedies we've had tied to the hurricanes, is our Guard, men and women have been ridiculously good, and including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, we could not have been anywhere close to where we are without their participation. But I'll give you one example of the challenge. I used to meet with tags, and each state has one. How much time do I have here, Pete?
Sir, this is the end.
This is the end? Okay. Not the end, just...
Not the final
okay.
end.
This is actually a great way to wrap it up. I was sitting in the tank one day having a discussion with about a dozen tags. They're the senior officer assigned or selected by the governor. And Lindsey Graham once told me, in South Carolina, if you're going to run for office down there, if you don't kiss the ring of whoever the tag is, you're not going to win, just to give you an example. And at the end of this meeting, and I really worked hard to try to facilitate the relationship between the Guard and the reserve, the Guard and the active duty side, particularly the Army, because we're all in this fight together. And at the end of the day, at the end of the meeting, this two-star in the back of the room puts his hands up and he says, just to tell you, Chairman, this is going to be my last meeting. I said, why is that? He says, because tomorrow, he was from Alaska. Tomorrow, Sarah Palin is going to announce, or it's going to be announced that she's going to be McCain's number 2, and I'm going to go be the lieutenant governor. And to me, that just said volumes about the political life of a tag, hand-selected by every governor, and I understand all that, and the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, who am I? And I just think they have to work it incredibly hard. And in the end, you can do it, but what's more important? And how do you look yourself in the mirror and say, I did the right thing? Thanks. God bless you.
Sir, thank you for kicking this off. I've given you the coveted Naval Institute pen.
No, it is coveted.
Yes, sir, and thank you again.
For those of us that have been around for a while, you know, in the Navy for 45 years, and I hadn't moved home, I live a couple miles from here. But at that point in time, I had 45 years worth of stuff and 5 years worth of room in my house. So I appreciate small gifts.
Thank you again, sir. Okay, we're going to take a short break, and we'd like everybody back in their seats by 10:00 for the panel. Thank you.